Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August edition of the Red Review, a podcast produced by Socialist Action. My name is Emily. I use she, her pronouns, and I am delighted to be one of your co-hosts today.
And equally delighted as Emily, I hope, is me, Daniel. I use he, him pronouns, and I am another one of your co-hosts for this month.
We're going to be talking about a lot of issues that we don't feel are being quite given justice in this election coverage. So we're going to do some in-depth explorations of the COVID fourth wave, the latest IPCC report, and of course, the US and Canadian withdrawal from Afghanistan, plus some extra headlines that you may have missed at the end of the podcast.
All the people that worked on this podcast, including Emily and myself as co-hosts, the people that help us with scripting, we all live on stolen Indigenous land from across Turtle Island, and we want to join in the struggle for Indigenous self-determination by demanding that there can be no reconciliation without restitution. And that includes land back and seizing the assets of the major resource corporations and returning them to the commons.
And as we begin today, we do want to just give a heads up that we talk about some pretty serious stuff, and there is brief discussion of suicidal ideation. We will be providing some resources in the description.
Now we turn to our comrade Ellen for what has quickly become a fan favorite, our monthly sponsor announcement.
Just over 1 year ago, Justin Trudeau banned 1,500 models of military-style firearms for sale, transport, and use. This was following the country's worst gun massacre in Nova Scotia in April 2020. Despite this, however, Canada continues to host one of the world's top 10 global aerospace and defense companies. This month, then, we are proud to announce we are not sponsored by General Dynamics, a weapons manufacturing company that signs millions of dollar contracts for the Pentagon. On August 20th of this year, in a news release, General Dynamics Mission Systems, as it is known in Canada, announced the establishment of a Centre of Excellence in Sherbrooke, Quebec, to build remotely piloted aircraft systems leveraging $9 million from the Government of Quebec through Investissement Québec and assistance from La Flamme Aero Incorporated, one of Quebec's emerging aerospace innovators. General Dynamics is an American-based aerospace and defense company headquartered in Virginia, and in 2020 had worldwide sales of $37.9 billion and a workforce of over 100,000 full-time employees. According to Project Plowshares, a non-profit Canadian Peace Research Institute, General Dynamics is one of the top 5 military contractors in Canada. So much for Canada's reputation as a peacemaker among nations.
Unless you've been living under a rock or you're just not as addicted to the news as I am, you would know that on September 20th, voters are going to the polls in Canada for one of the shortest federal election campaigns in Canadian history, literally 36 days long, the bare minimum number of days a campaign can be. And ironically enough, though Justin Trudeau called this election in the hopes of securing himself a majority, the polling gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives is narrowing, and I believe the Tories have actually overtaken the Liberals in the polls. Many mainstream media pundits are speculating Justin Trudeau has lost his gamble here.
I think so.
As the August 17th Nova Scotia provincial election showed, voters don't always reward incumbent governments during a deadly pandemic, even though every single minority government in the provinces that has gone to an election during the pandemic then won a majority. Nova Scotia bucked that trend in a big way.
No, so in Nova Scotia, the Liberals called an election, and now it is a majority Conservative government in Nova Scotia.
Yep.
They absolutely got blown out. The polling was completely off in that case. Trudeau probably now, I'm assuming, is sweating a bit, absolutely plummeting in the polls. NDP is looking to gain seats compared to 2019, but they still are predicted to, come in a distant third place. Liberals still are leading the polls in terms of winning the most number of seats just because of the first past the post system. As much as, we like to remember Trudeau saying that 2015 would be the last election under the first past the post system. Here we are 2 elections later, and we're stuck again in this, lesser evilism.
He may actually be regretting that choice now, but who knows? As I say, if you're listening to us, you may already be attuned to a lot of the news media, and you probably know all of the election issues that are pretty top of mind. The housing crisis, for one, with skyrocketing house and rental prices, food insecurity, vaccine rollouts, daycare, schools. All of these issues are, of course, super important and very, very top of mind for a reason. But we wanted to talk about some issues that are not getting the attention that they deserve. These are really significant issues that impact all of us, not just those of us who live in the Canadian state. And we really need to be making these issues top of mind as we head to the polls, and also in all of our activism that exists beyond that, which is to say, the vast majority of it.
This month, we're going to highlight some of those existential threats that, as Emily mentioned, are not facing only us Canadians, but really the working class the world over. We are talking about deadly pandemics and the financial crisis and the mass immiseration of working class people due to COVID. And, discussing how do we move forward as a society as this pandemic continues on into a 4th wave. We're going to talk about climate change, perhaps the single biggest threat facing humanity, where the phrase extinction is not an exaggeration. And lastly, we're going to talk about foreign affairs, international policies. And these are really the policies where all of the parties in Canada are virtually indistinguishable. No one is talking about defunding the military. No one is talking about getting out of NATO. Yet these demands need to be put forward unless we, wish to continue on with this really, really slow reformism, slow electoralism that really just changes the color of the leading party every few years rather than actually addressing the systemic ways in which our society doesn't serve people, but rather profit.
I also want to highlight Socialist Action has published a fantastic document bringing forward our policy objectives and our demands going into this election and all of the things that the major governing parties will not be addressing. Nonetheless, because of the New Democratic Party's long-standing affiliation and basis in the working class and labor movements, we do critically support the NDP going into this election.
We would urge all of our listeners to vote NDP, not because we support 100% their platform. We are not sycophants here, but we understand that the NDP is the only viable working class party with actual affiliation with the labor movement. And as Marxists, the working class is really what we perceive to be the class with the most transformative potential in society. So not only do we urge people to vote for the NDP, we urge people to engage with the NDP and join us in our efforts to bring them sharply to the left and to propose those policies and those demands that we think actually address the systemic failures of capitalism in the world today. Not only do we want the NDP to take steps forward in this election, we want them to be transformed into truly a vehicle for working class movement building and for a serious attempt at building a revolutionary party one day down the road.
So I know we said that we were going to be discussing a lot of things that were not getting enough attention in the election. Now, obviously, the COVID pandemic and climate change are getting a lot of coverage, but not always the kind of coverage that we would prefer. And the critical analysis of a lot of the media coverage is what we would consider lacking. On August 11th, the CBC proclaimed there was no doubt that Canada is now in a 4th wave of COVID-19, and cases are spiking across much of the country, particularly in Western Canada. While new cases dipped below 400 cases a day back in July, now at the end of August and beginning of September, we've got well over 3,000 new cases a day.
In provinces like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec, The fourth wave is threatening to surpass the peak of previous waves. And also, the Northwest Territories faced their biggest outbreak to date earlier this month. The fourth wave is being fueled by the incredibly contagious Delta variant, which was first identified in India, and it fueled its deadly second wave, which we talked about back in May. 90% of new cases are caused by the Delta variant, and this is despite the fact that almost 84% of eligible Canadians, which are those who are over the age of 12 and don't have any medical exemptions, at least 84% of eligible Canadians received at least one dose of vaccine, which represents 66% of Canadians in general. But a plateau has been reached, and the current levels of vaccination are not enough to achieve herd immunity. As a result, thousands of doses of vaccines are expiring in Canada and are being thrown out, which to us is emblematic of the vaccine apartheid that the Canadian state presides over and benefits from. You can recall from previous episodes of the podcast where we talked about Canada objecting to a World Trade Organization proposal to waive intellectual property restrictions for COVID-19 vaccines. And Canada was also the only G7 country to dip into the COVAX stockpile of vaccines that were meant for impoverished countries.
Yeah, and it's particularly galling to read stories of all of these millions of wasted doses, which I realize happens. Like, it's inevitable that there will be some amount of wasted doses, but the millions of doses that have gone to waste is really sickening to read about in light of the fact that there are many, many countries where less than 1% of the population has been able to receive a vaccine. It's just one more emblematic issue of the vaccine apartheid. And it sickens and horrifies me that there are so many people literally dying to be able to get the vaccine, whereas others are still continuing to refuse to do so.
What confuses me, though, is that my friends from undergrad who were big Elon Musk stans always told me that capitalism is super efficient. So I'm confused as to how so much waste with these vaccines can be going on.
Yeah.
I know, right?
The dreadful efficiency of capitalism, right?
The dreadful efficiency. It's almost bland how efficient it is, how everybody has food to eat, how everybody has a house, and how climate change has been addressed really quickly and in a way that, is equitable. It's really remarkable and almost boring how efficient everything is. Now, the fourth wave, just like all previous waves, was very accurately predicted by epidemiologists and public health officials as governments reopened gyms and indoor dining and other businesses, as British Columbia revoked their mask mandate, although this was a move they later had to reverse. As Jason Kenney's United Conservative government in Alberta ended virtually all public health measures on July 1st, our politicians condemned us to a very predictable fourth wave, while also withholding the many public health policies proposed by epidemiologists and public health officials that could have effectively slowed the spread of the virus. At the same time, the very same government officials abandoned us. In Alberta, Jason Kenney has not addressed the public for almost a month, his last public statement coming on August 9th. What's even worse is Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, also has not addressed the public since August 13th, despite the growing fourth wave.
Yep. 1/3 of COVID cases in Canada right now are in Alberta.
That is a lot, because Alberta is not 1/3 of this country's population.
With school around the corner and kids under 12 still ineligible for the vaccine, government officials are bracing us for a difficult autumn and winter rather than enacting policies that will actually mitigate viral spread and save lives. And as a teacher going back to in-person work, I can confirm I am nervous. Like always, an open and unregulated economy is the goal. Government officials are instead tasked with mitigating COVID-19 just enough to prevent the complete collapse of our healthcare system rather than actually meaningfully pursuing a COVID-0 strategy. I also do want to throw in, I do not understand people on the left who repeat right-winger talking points of the government lockdowns being a measure of trying to control and repress the population, the capitalist governments very clearly do not want to lock down, do not want to meaningfully respond to this, and do not seem to really care if massive numbers of workers die in their line of work, in the pursuit of capitalist profit. The only thing they care about is that the COVID pandemic does not actually affect profit. And a collapsed healthcare system, not great for business. It has been extremely clear for this entire pandemic that they don't really care about controlling us, they care about preserving profits. And it just boggles my mind to see people on the left repeating these baseless right-wing talking points.
Yeah, it's just very obviously not true.
Fight with us in the comments.
Yeah, we can see Doug Ford in Ontario reopen the economy during essentially the middle of the second wave. The hospitals were still full, and he opened it up. He opened up the malls so that you can keep profit going, even though predictably it led to a really bad third wave. And they only began enacting restrictions again when it became clear that otherwise literally hospitals would have to turn away people. So they're doing the bare minimum. And part of their strategy then is they're pursuing more punitive strategies rather than actually doing things that are meaningful, even if they might hurt profit. And part of these punitive strategies is, this COVID vaccine passport program. We're not against it, but it's really telling that that's basically the only policy that they're willing to pursue here. So currently, you have British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, and now Ontario have all instituted some type of vaccine passport program where residents will not be able to attend movies, go to gyms, or go for indoor dining unless they're fully inoculated against COVID-19. Other provinces like Alberta, and Jason Kenney there, refuse to implement any such program, with this argument that it invades privacy.
And there is absolutely a lot to be critical of with the vaccine pass programs. Absolutely. First of all, we've been talking about this a fair bit in Socialist Action. What equity measures are in place to ensure that impoverished people are able to access this form of ID, to ensure that undocumented migrants are not targeted for deportation as a result of having to access and get this ID, or even be able to access vaccinations safely in the first place. There is so much inequity that is baked into the way our vaccines have been rolled out that does need to be meaningfully addressed. But we have seen in the last drive to get everyone vaccinated that really the majority of people who are not getting vaccinated, the vast majority of them are not anti-vax conspiracy theorists. The vast majority of people who remain unvaccinated are people who don't have access to reliable information, don't have a primary care physician, people who can't get sick days off if they experience negative side effects. Communities who historically have every reason to distrust the medical community. There is absolutely a lot of reasons why people are vaccine hesitant that needs to be approached with care, with sympathy, and with community-based, compassionate approaches. And this vaccine pass does not get to the need for community-oriented care and community-oriented access. That is what we should be critical of, not the impact on our rights and freedoms. There are many more things that impact our rights and freedoms, a great deal more that we need to focus our attention on.
In some ways, we can also invert this idea that people are focusing so much on the right to go to see the movies rather than the right of people to be able to work for, a living and not be exposed to a deadly virus if it could otherwise be prevented. And that's what vaccines help do. It helps prevent infection in the first place. As you mentioned, Emily, we still don't have an adequate employer-paid sick days program. That remains missing, even though we are now a year and a half into this pandemic. 58% of Canadian workers do not have paid sick days provided by their employer. And the inadequate 3 government-paid sick days, which was instituted, let's say, in Ontario during the pandemic, is really inadequate because it's only 3 days, it's government paid, and that doesn't even apply to independent contractors, what Uber categorizes their workers as, like you. So instead, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals are now campaigning on a program of 10 paid sick days for federally regulated employees. I'm confused why they didn't do this during their first 2 terms.
Yeah, that seems like something that you would have brought in near the beginning of a pandemic. I don't know. While paid sick days are being held up as a COVID carrot by Trudeau, the federal NDP are dipping their toes into some demands that are actually beginning to reorient some of the purpose of our economy. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has pledged to ban the opening of any new for-profit long-term care facilities and to nationalize Revera, which is one of the biggest for-profit long-term care home operators in the country. The reason being for this, for-profit long-term care facilities saw many more deaths than non-profit and municipal long-term care facilities.
And I can attest to this, not necessarily during the pandemic. My mom is a nurse, and she worked before she got a job at a hospital in one of these for-profit long-term care facilities. And she has so many horror stories, even before the pandemic, where the nurses who are working there had limits on how many diapers they can use in a shift, how many blankets and towels they can use. So if a resident soils themselves one too many times, as a worker, at a certain point, you are not actually allowed anymore to care for them because they are just penny pinching at every single turn. And that should not be tolerated when it comes to the provision of healthcare, especially for our elders and our really vulnerable people.
Absolutely. And it is also important to note that it is not only elderly people, disabled people who are unable to access at-home care, which remains incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult to access, and many people who cannot access supportive, accessible housing do end up living in long-term care homes as well.
And so as much as Canada likes to tout itself as having a universal healthcare system, the fact that we have a for-profit long-term care sector that is parallel to everything else makes no sense to me. So it's great to see the NDP take some concrete steps in that direction.
However, this of course does not meaningfully address workplace and retail settings, which are a major source of community spread. During the second wave in Manitoba, 25% of community spread came from workplaces, and honestly, that number seems a little low to me. I'm sure it was higher in Ontario as well.
Yes, and that's just what could be traced accurately back to the workplace. And then that doesn't include the people who then get infected by, let's say, their spouse who is working. That would then be considered personal spread. But even though the original infection or the original outbreak could have been workplace oriented, but it is one of the major drivers. And that is something that none of the parties are really addressing. Why is it that public health measures at the level of our work is being dominated by the interests of shareholders and CEOs rather than the people actually doing the work?
Realistically, more than vaccines, which are being touted as this cure-all, 2 shots to save the economy, what we really need is an economy that is run by the people and for the people. An economy for the people rather than a for-profit system would be able to achieve COVID-0 by immediately shutting down all non-essential production as necessary without leaving workers destitute. This is our vision, and it is possible. Their vision is one where people are forced to work retail for minimum wage while sick or else not be able to make rent, while Air Canada and other massive corporations get bailed out by the federal government to the tune of billions of dollars. This is why in every wave of COVID-19, there are restrictions on basic access to seeing friends and family, but not any restrictions on for-profit businesses slowing down production. We are expected to go to work at really non-essential places of business, but stay home every other hour of the day. I remember last Christmas reading somewhere that was like, do you want to spend Christmas dinner with your family? Consider all of you getting a job at the same indoor dining restaurant.
But that's exactly every single time I would see Trudeau or Ford on the news talking about how we all have to make sacrifices and how we all need to stay home for Thanksgiving or Christmas, but in the same breath, not announce a lockdown. So we were still expected to go to work. There would be no moratorium on evictions. We would be forced to work 8 hours a day, but going to see our friends and family was the sacrifice we had to make. Why can't they sacrifice some of the billions in profits that they make? Why is it that we have to sacrifice everything every single time?
Under capitalism, we exist to make work and make profit for the privileged capitalist class. And under a workers' government, the economy exists to make our lives better. Uncontrolled spread of COVID-19 such that it is going to become an endemic disease. There is no way to get to COVID-0 anymore. COVID-19 is now endemic to the human species. So uncontrolled spread of COVID-19 is only compatible with short-term profits and not an easier life for us.
Yeah, that is the contradiction with COVID. All the economic decisions made really hurt us, but did not hurt the economy. Stock market is still doing great, and that is a contradiction. That should make us all think about how capitalism is no longer compatible, or really hasn't been for a long time, with human flourishing.
And as we know, the COVID pandemic has massively impoverished many, many, many people. The US working class, and I regret that I don't have the statistics for Canada, but the US working class has lost trillions of dollars during this pandemic, during this massive crisis. And what do you know? American billionaires, this is from inequality.org, American billionaires since March of 2020 have seen their wealth surge by over $1.8 trillion. Gosh, I wonder where that money came from.
Well, clearly they picked up a few extra shifts. You know, they worked overtime. They really raked in that hero pay. They rolled up their sleeves, and, you know, Jeff Bezos. How does the song go?
Come on, Jeff, get him!
That's what he did. He woke up every day, 4 a.m. while everybody else was still sleeping, and he got to work. Now, in reality, what this means is that as the capitalist class gains in wealth, we lose wealth. It really is a zero-sum game. Yet it's the workers who are on the front lines. It is the workers who risk getting infected with a deadly virus. It is workers who get evicted. And it is workers then who need to rise up, because otherwise, well, they're going to keep shaking us down for everything they have. Obviously, they have no scruples. They don't really care that they're causing us to become more and more destitute, because that's directly linked to their own wealth accumulation. Our debt is their yacht. And that's what COVID, more than anything, is teaching a lot of people.
Many people have discussed COVID really is just the warm-up act. COVID is a small, infinitesimally small crisis compared to what is coming. In 2019, after only 4 years of Liberal rule, on a per capita basis, Canada was actually tied with the United States for the third worst polluter in the world, behind only Saudi Arabia and Australia.
That's a bronze medal for those keeping track at home.
So, Daniel, I'll turn it over to you. You're the scientist. You talk about the IPCC report.
So I actually read the summary for policymakers. In Socialist Action, I sometimes help write policy, so that makes me a policymaker. And every time the IPCC report comes out, it's just terrifying. So on August 6th, no exception, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its sixth assessment report. Right now, global surface temperature is 1.09 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial averages. Atmospheric CO2 has increased 47% over pre-industrial averages, and this far exceeds the natural multi-millennial changes between glacial and interglacial periods. For the people that argue that the climate changes naturally, what we're seeing in the last 10 to 20 years or the last 100 years is orders of magnitude larger than what happens naturally. And for all the people that talked about how the pandemic showed us that we can, decarbonize rapidly, even in 2020 during the pandemic, there was no detectable decrease in the observed CO2 growth rate. Meaning, as a planet, we are still increasing our level of emissions year over year. Quote from the report, "It is virtually certain that hot extremes, including heat waves, have become more frequent and more intense across most land regions since the 1950s. Here's another quote. "The frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events have increased since the 1950s over most land area for which observational data are sufficient for trend analysis." So all those wildfires we're seeing, all the floods we're seeing, stronger hurricanes, yeah, it's a scientific consensus that these are being exacerbated by climate change. We are now in the beginning stages of what is going to be a more extreme world when it comes to weather.
Listeners of the podcast know we've already talked in depth about the wildfires in British Columbia, and having this report just confirms that this is not only an exception, this is going to become the new rule.
Yes, the IPCC report is useful for identifying what we already, see, but it also predicts things. And what was very scary for me is even in a scenario where we immediately begin cutting emissions and achieve global net zero emissions by 2050, the world will continue to heat up to around 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages, which means that the extreme weather events we see now will continue to get worse, even if we immediately make changes. But if we do make those immediate changes, at least there will be a world to salvage, because the modeled warming that would occur if we simply curb our emissions, or heaven forbid, continue increasing greenhouse gas emissions, approaches and exceeds 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And that's at a level that we cannot, we are talking extinction level events at that point. Extreme heat events that used to happen once in a decade already occur now almost 3 times a decade with the 1 degree of warming we already have. With 1.5 degrees of warming, which is virtually assured, they will begin happening 4 times a decade. If we hit 4 degrees of warming, they will happen every year. So going from a once in a decade event, that will become, like you said, the new rule every single year. And these same frightening projections are the same for droughts and for floods.
But the thing that I keep turning to is that I am at heart a lover of humans.
Yeah, me too.
I am a tremendous believer in human potential. I am not one to get locked in the doom and gloom of humans are terrible and humans are the real virus. First of all, capitalism is the virus, not humans.
Yes.
But second of all, there is cause for hope. The IPCC is not saying everything is completely hopeless, all is lost, abandon ship now, give up, crawl under a rock, wait for death. The IPCC report says that achieving net zero CO2 emissions would result in surface temperatures gradually reversing. And even though other climate changes like sea level rise would take centuries or millennia to reverse course, that isn't an unsolvable issue. Humans are phenomenal innovators. What we need to do is orient our societies towards dealing with this change, confronting this challenge head on, because we are very smart. We have immense resources. We have immense capabilities. But what we are lacking is the political drive and the political leadership to make it happen.
I agree with you as well. I used to be more of a nihilist when it came to climate change because I was a kid and no one seemed to talk to me at the same level I was operating when it came to climate change. Since I was in grade school, I was anticipating massive floods and clinging to a piece of driftwood in the ocean. But now that I've encountered those radical groups that talk about the real scope of the problem and also the solutions that are necessary and proportionate to the problem, I no longer find myself with the same nihilistic tendencies. Is this a massive challenge for us to overcome? Absolutely. But the only hurdle in the way for me now is our economic system that is entirely oriented not towards continued human existence, but towards short-term profits for an incredibly small number of people.
Can I share a story?
Absolutely.
So the IPCC report that came out in 2018 got a lot of attention. That was the one that was we have 12 years to turn this ship around or else.
Yes.
And that got a lot of attention. It got a lot of people talking. And it actually plunged me into a really, really deep depression. And I think I was not the only one.
Oh, no, absolutely. That was actually the peak of my own obsession with self-immolation. At that time, I was not organized with any groups. And as an individual, the only way I could think of personally making a difference would be to somehow make such a newsworthy event, like by lighting myself on fire, and then maybe that would galvanize people. I've since abandoned that idea because I've read reports of people who had the same thought as me, went through with it, and it didn't change anything. So the lesson for me then is acting alone. All you're doing is shouting into the void.
I remember having a similar thought. I remember thinking that, if my death would accomplish anything, if my death would help save lives, I would do it. But, and I want to clarify, I'm no longer in that place. I'm okay.
Me too. Also, no one check in with us super urgently. We're okay. Use that emotional capacity for something else. We don't need it right now.
But within, I would say, about a month or two of being in that really dark and terrible place, I found an ad on my Facebook feed from Socialist Action advertising the November Educational. And I went and I met the most incredible, passionate, dedicated activists who were connected with all kinds of other groups who were deeply passionate about making a better world and believing desperately and deeply and truly that it is possible for us to come together to fight and actually build a better world. I joined on the spot, and I can truthfully say I have never gotten to the same level of despair as before, because I know now I am connected to a team of passionate and dedicated activists, not only in Socialist Action, but all of our friends and sister networks all around the world, because we are a strong, committed group. All of us are deeply, deeply passionate and committed to changing the world and changing our system. There is cause for hope because we have the people's power. Now, I will still say I am scared absolutely shitless. And I also want to say that, we are speaking from the very privileged position of being in the Imperial Core. We are not ever going to see the worst effects of climate change. We will see devastating effects of climate change as farmers out west are seeing now. Devastating drought, devastating fires, devastating floods. We will experience massive hardship and loss, but our hardship and loss is nothing compared to what the most impoverished people in Canada and around the world are going to experience and are experiencing right now. And our focus and our solidarity must be oriented towards them at all times.
Do you know who's not taking the issue of climate change seriously? The Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Jonathan Wilkinson. In the aftermath of the IPCC report earlier this month, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change defended the Liberal government's 2018 purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Boo.
Right? They bought this pipeline for $4.5 billion, and Wilkinson says that the money generated by the pipeline is needed for Canada to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The pipeline is currently being expanded at a cost of over $12 billion, and this will double the capacity of this pipeline to carry crude oil from Alberta to British Columbia from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. That is a lot of oil for someone who's apparently our climate change minister.
Well, and also, I do want to say the incredible irony of saying the money generated from the pipeline will help us achieve net zero carbon emissions. Going back to what you were saying earlier, that's like someone taking one more shot of whiskey and saying, I need one more drink before I can address my alcoholism. Not to make light of alcoholism. That is not what we are trying to do. But just it's a very serious issue. You need to address it. One more isn't gonna help.
No, one more is not going to help. Actually, if you just didn't buy the pipeline, you wouldn't need any money to cut that amount of emissions. You just didn't do anything. This is putting you into the negative with the hope that eventually you'll get into the positive, which just don't go into the negative in the first place. Now, that very same Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Wilkinson, tweeted on August 18th, quote, "We will continue to fight climate change while keeping Canadians safe by Number 1, hiring 1,000 new firefighters. Number 2, making homes more resilient to climate change. Number 3, enhancing wildfire readiness in national parks. And number 4, innovating climate adaptation strategies." Now, not a single one of those is a solution for climate change at all. In fact, every single one of those is dealing with the symptoms of climate change. It's really sad for me to see the Minister of Climate Change tout 1,000 new firefighters as the solution to climate change. What?
Yeah, that's not fighting climate change, Mr. Wilkinson. That is fighting one of the most visible symptoms of climate change, which realistically, we should have trained firefighters already.
Yeah, how are we so unprepared at this point?
Yeah, we've known that this was coming for a while, and yet every single time. I mean, I guess after COVID, I shouldn't be surprised when governments are taken unprepared by crises that we've seen coming for decades.
Oh, yeah.
And nonetheless, every single time, I'm still surprised.
I'm still surprised, but that is the extent to what the Liberals can offer as a solution. All they can offer is the bare minimum in terms of dealing with the symptoms of the deep, deep crises of capitalism. The Canadian state itself is barreling towards a cliff. And not only are we driving towards a cliff with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, we are accelerating. Before the G7 summit earlier in the summer, it was reported that Canada and the US were the only members of the G7 to not reduce emissions since signing the Paris Accord in 2016. And Canada, in fact, exhibited the greatest increase in emissions since 2016, all of which occurred under Trudeau's leadership.
Boo.
Boo, Trudeau, in case you're listening. Let our boos fuel you as you do something decent for once.
Don't vote Liberal.
Yeah, also, that should be a given at this point. Don't vote for the Liberals. It's a vote for a pipeline at this point. There's no other way to phrase it. They're just unabashedly pro-fossil fuel, because these companies are essentially what dictates our entire country's direction.
While the promises of the federal Liberals are simultaneously not enough and also extremely dubious as to whether they'd be enacted in the first place, the Progressive Conservatives instead pledged to roll back Canada's emission targets to a 30% decrease below 2005 levels rather than the 40% decrease that the Liberals have promised. The veteran earth scientist David Hughes says we can only achieve our emission targets if oil and gas production is significantly reduced from the CER's projected levels. Pursuing policies that encourage production growth, such as the TMX pipeline expansion and the LNG exports, will ensure that Canada will not meet its emission reduction commitments.
The Trans Mountain Pipeline is also being fiercely opposed by Indigenous land defenders. And when it comes to these massive infrastructure projects, we can never minimize, and we should never minimize, the impacts it has on Indigenous self-determination. So one of these groups that's opposing the Trans Mountain Pipeline are the Tiny House Warriors. Their mission is to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline from crossing unceded Secwepemc territory. And their strategy is building 10 tiny houses along the over 500-kilometer route and asserting Secwepemc law and jurisdiction and blocking access to this pipeline. Now, on August 27th, Tiny House Warriors protested in Toronto outside the office of Chrystia Freeland, who is currently our Deputy Prime Minister, for her role in the Trans Mountain Canada project. Hours later, Tiny House Warrior Kanahus Manuel was arrested and detained by RCMP at Toronto International Airport. That is what our state is currently doing to the people that are trying to save us all from this catastrophic project.
And because the TMX pipeline is happening in Canada, of course, it's getting a lot of attention here. But what is not getting a lot of attention from the Canadian news media is Line 3. Line 3 is a proposed pipeline expansion that will bring nearly 1 million barrels of tar sands per day from Alberta into Superior, Wisconsin. And it is being built by Enbridge, a Canadian pipeline company, which is responsible for the largest inland oil spill in the US ever. They're trying to build a new pipeline corridor through the untouched wetlands and the treaty territory of the Anishinaabe peoples through the Mississippi River headwaters to the shores of Lake Superior, where it can then be shipped out for export and refinement. All of this is taken from stopline3.org, and there's a lot of really, really excellent information there on how to get involved and how to support the fabulous, dedicated protesters who are there, who are putting themselves on the line, many of whom are facing very, very serious repercussions legally and also a lot of physical backlash. Enbridge itself has paid for accommodations and transportation for hundreds of police officers to come in and surveil and attack water protectors who are based in Minnesota, where most of the action is taking place and all of the protests are based. How is this not deeply disturbing, and how is this not making news that a Canadian company has basically purchased the loyalty and the action of American police forces to attack water protectors who are defending their land and their water?
It's ridiculous. And that is one of my go-to arguments as to why we need to defund the police. If the police was on our side, they would see what these for-profit gas companies, oil companies are doing, and they would be on our side fighting against it because they literally threaten all of us. But instead, they're there to protect property and profit. So that's why they're the ones fighting against us. And as long as they do that, well, they're no ally to us.
Exactly. As white settlers, we owe an incredible debt to Indigenous peoples, and it is through activism that I try to repay that debt. It is through solidarity actions, through working with Indigenous groups, through supporting Indigenous-led actions that we will make restitution by deferring to Indigenous leadership and by fighting for land back. That is the way out of this imperialist, exploitative, capitalist model of production and back towards a more humane, rational, reasonable, and well-informed, human-oriented way of living.
That's beautiful. And I agree fully. And that's why, like always, we'll also include all the links to the different groups that are fighting to protect water, to defend land. This will include different GoFundMes and other fundraising links. And if you are able to, we strongly encourage you to support those people on the front lines who are fighting not only for their self-determination, which alone obviously is worth supporting, but they are also there fighting against the companies that are literally putting their profits ahead of all of our own lives.
For their part, the federal NDP does pledge to end subsidies for all oil and gas companies if elected and redirect them towards renewable energy. This is a start and it is worthwhile, but an immediate solution we all must demand is the nationalization of the energy sector, coupled with an immediate decarbonization of our energy production. No more old-growth logging, no more pipelines, no more violation of Indigenous self-determination, and immediate demilitarization, not just of police, but of the entire state. The Department of National Defense is by far the federal government's biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, though it is not counted towards our overall carbon budget. I also do want to mention that I have my suspicions about the truth of the NDP's statements because, in fact, the BC NDP government, which is the only provincial NDP government in the country, oil subsidies have actually increased under the BC NDP's leadership up to, I was reading, up to $1.3 billion.
And even federally, actually, Jagmeet Singh earlier in the year defended Enbridge Line 5. So that is why, as members of the NDP Socialist Caucus, we're inside the NDP pushing for them to turn sharply to the left on issues of climate change, on issues of Indigenous self-determination. We need them to return to a grassroots model where our voice is heard within the NDP. Because what we're talking about here is popular within the NDP.
This month, September 2021, the federal Liberals may be making election promises yet again for a nationwide pharmacare program that will never materialize under their leadership. While they make empty promises, we at Red Review are preparing our loyal listeners for a more auspicious anniversary. October will be the 60th anniversary of Medicare in Canada. In 1960, Tommy Douglas, one of the founders of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, was elected Premier in Saskatchewan and paved the way for Canada's first publicly funded single-payer medical system. This revolutionary new system would see publicly funded Medicare not just in hospitals but in clinics and doctors' offices as well. Douglas and the CCF won a mandate to proceed, and Douglas's successor, Woodrow Lloyd, continued the struggle in Saskatchewan, while Douglas went on to lead the newly formed New Democratic Party. The bill was passed in Saskatchewan in November 1961 to take effect on July 1st. 90% of doctors in Saskatchewan, however, fearing loss of income, went on strike for 23 days. The Saskatchewan government therefore brought in doctors who supported the new system from Britain, Canada, and the United States, and the system was a resounding success. This then, for us at Red Review, is an anniversary to celebrate and is yet another quintessential Canadian heritage moment.
One of the last things we're going to be talking about is foreign policy, which tends not to be a top-of-mind election issue, as Eve Engler said in last month's interview. Canadians don't tend to care much about foreign policy when it comes to deciding who to vote for. However, it is important that we talk about U.S. imperialism and its recent defeat in Afghanistan. For the past 20 years, the American empire has taken upon itself the burden of so many of its imperial forebears to wage endless, expensive, ineffective, and utterly useless wars in Afghanistan. Though it remains to be seen what effects this will have on the American empire, Afghanistan did not earn the reputation of the graveyard of empires for no reason. The harsh, arid climate, the mountainous and treacherous geography, and the long history of strife, as well as the incredible strength and stalwart determination of the people of Afghanistan, have made it a nearly impossible place to maintain control over. But the resources that Afghanistan contains, the rare earth elements, the lithium, the lapis lazuli, the emeralds and other gemstones, and of course the land's capacity for opium production, not to mention its geostrategic location, ripe for a fresh pipeline or new political alliances, all contribute to making Afghanistan a desirable location from the perspective of empire.
The recent uproar in the media surrounding America's chaotic and ill-planned withdrawal from Afghanistan is, by some accounts, warranted, given the severity of the situation and the horrific images familiar to all of us by now. Yet, for all the coverage that this Central Asian nation has received lately, there's a profound lack of discussion as to why we were there in the first place. Indeed, the focus has shifted onto what Biden presumes is a lack of courage on the part of Afghan people, indicating that America did everything it could to help the country, but the people there were just too lazy or stupid to receive what really ought to have been considered a righteous gift from America. The conversation shifts away from America's role in causing the conflict in the first place, and instead focuses on absurdities. The basis of this shift is an outright fabrication, and we need to oppose this.
While Joe Biden mouths off propaganda and platitudes, horrific images are circulating of the chaotic American evacuation, alongside images of the Taliban's advance signaling a new era in Afghan politics, though some would consider it a return to things exactly as they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, not much has changed. So instead, we're going to be really sharp in our focus today, and we're going to focus on imperialism. So while there is a lot of really important coverage of what is happening right now to people in Afghanistan, we want to keep a very sharp focus on what's been happening historically in this region from the lens of imperialism. We want to, more than anything, decry and denounce American imperialism and Canada's role in what's happening. We want to keep a sharp focus on imperialism, on United States interventionism, because this is one of the biggest obstacles to the working class the world over. It's sometimes said that if socialism ever took a hold in America, it would succeed because then America couldn't invade it and overthrow its government. So this is what's used to keep down people.
In 1979, the United States funded armed insurgents who organized around radical religious principles around the socialist leaders of Afghanistan, who themselves had recently overthrown the military dictatorship of the Soviet Union in their country. This was done with the intention of both toppling the socialist regime in Afghanistan and, more important to the Americans, draining the resources of the Soviet Union, who in their view could not afford a civil war in a pro-Soviet state in such close proximity to the USSR. In doing so, the United States also provided training and propaganda for these Afghan insurgents, including incredibly graphic educational materials for children featuring lessons on counting with guns, hand grenades, and daggers instead of apples, oranges, and bananas. These materials and others were designed and printed at the University of Nebraska at its Center for Afghanistan Studies. When the Soviet-backed regime fell in 1992, Afghanistan had very little in the way of a centralized government, with local warlords ruling over dozens of territories scattered across the country. Again, the geography of Afghanistan makes it very, very difficult to have a centralized government system because so many of the valleys are very, very inaccessible and are held by local governments rather than any kind of centralized system. This resulted in long civil wars with a lot of foreign backing. The Taliban came into existence in 1994, and they took power from 1996 through to 2001, filling a power vacuum brought about in no small part by Western and Soviet interference in Afghanistan.
After the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in 2001, the United States, Canada, and Britain invaded Afghanistan with the stated objective of eliminating the Taliban leadership in order to prevent al-Qaeda from having a base of operations in the country. So within 1 year, the major objectives stated in the media had been achieved. The Taliban government collapsed, nearly all of the leaders were dead or on the run. Yet, as we might expect, the invading Western nations decided to stick around for a while, and the ensuing 20-year war can only be described as a military occupation with the main goals of interfering with Russian, Chinese, and Central Asian political affairs, the extraction of resources, particularly the construction of pipelines and the production of opium, and the ratcheting up of United States military spending as much as possible in order to secure massive profits for arms manufacturers such as Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and many others. The way that this functioned was to have no clear military objective, because if you have no objective, then you can just stick around for as long as you'd like. As revealed in the Afghanistan papers, 3-star General Douglas Lute, who served as the White House Afghan war czar, stated that, quote, "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan," end quote, and that, quote, "we didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking," end quote. That's very confident stuff from a 3-star general. At the same time, John Sopko, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, an office designed to investigate American aid spending in Afghanistan, described plainly how the, quote, "Afghan military and particularly the Afghan police has been a hopeless nightmare and disaster," end quote, referring to the very military and security forces set up by the United States under the pretense of supporting democracy abroad. In other words, the military had no clear objectives, and the government's own watchdogs were barking. Yet, the war continued. Evidently, it was not about military objectives, nor was it about democracy. The government that they installed was corrupt. And this has been recently embodied by the disgraced flight of former politician Ashraf Ghani from the country with over $150 million in cash, some of it literally flown out in a helicopter after the Taliban took power. Many of the key political figures installed by the Americans in Afghanistan were either corrupt or outright warlords. This is who we chose to partner with. So despite the credulity of some American special investigators, it is obvious that whatever the United States and its allies, including Canada, claimed to be doing in Afghanistan was a lie.
So what were they doing exactly? If it wasn't to defend the rights of women, if it wasn't to install a stable, democratically elected government in the region and to truly oust the Taliban and al-Qaeda, what was the point? So, as mentioned earlier, from the perspective of empire, Afghanistan has much to offer. Opium production increased to astronomical proportions as compared to during the Taliban rule in the 90s, fueling drug addiction epidemics worldwide. It has also had its resources pillaged throughout this period of incredible destabilization, which is a perfect time for eager foreign investors to pile in. Moreover, despite being an incredibly important geographical crossroads in Central Asia, it has, for better or for worse, thus far not had the ability to integrate itself into the strategic alliances of its neighbors due to the American puppet regime and the military occupation. More importantly, the military-industrial complex has gained immense sums of money to the tune of hundreds of billions per year, all for nothing other than pure greed. While this military machine has destroyed countless lives, ruined communities, ravaged the environment, and profited immensely, workers in the United States, Canada, and Britain have been footing the bill.
This may all change with the new Taliban regime, who has been openly signaling their willingness to engage with China, Pakistan, and other Central Asian states, and even Russia. The Taliban has been training their diplomatic corps for years while in exile in Doha, Qatar, as evidenced by their recent English language press conference, which at the very minimum was organized well. Afghanistan has had observer status within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the major military alliance in Asia, effectively an Asian NATO, which means that it will likely become a full member if stability is achieved within the new Taliban-led framework. Now, this is yet to be fully ironed out by the time that we're recording this, but other things to keep in mind then, you also have the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which may come to include Afghanistan as a natural course of action given the geography of the region and the shared border with China. These are developments the United States imperialist agenda could not accept, hence their 20-year-long military occupation of the country.
The United States-led occupation of Afghanistan was textbook imperialism. Clearly, they had no righteous humanistic intentions in mind. Their goals were geopolitical and resource-driven. They sought to prevent Afghanistan from functioning as a state in order to slow the development of any opposition to the global hegemony. They needed the resources Afghanistan has to offer. They used their military, diplomatic, and economic might to influence the country in every possible way, knowingly creating a weak puppet government to carry out their agenda. So to understand the recent withdrawal, we must bear in mind that the entire military operation in Afghanistan was a completely disorganized failure from the start because it was never meant to be achieving objectives. This explains the chaotic evacuation. It was as ill-conceived as the invasion itself. The occupation was meant to achieve an imperialist agenda, which it managed while it lasted. And as socialists, it is essential that we oppose these wars at all costs. They decimate countries, suppressing working class movements from developing, and serve only to feed the profit margins of already incredibly powerful and exploitative arms manufacturers and military contractors, not to mention those who deal in the drug trade or natural resources. I do want to say that despite the imperialist interventionism, there were a lot of human rights gains in Afghanistan. Ethnic minorities were much safer from persecution, and the rights of women and girls were far, far more advanced than they had been under the previous Taliban-led rule. This is not a testament to the US government's intervention and saving them from the terrible Taliban, though deeply oppressive the Taliban regime absolutely is. This is a testament to the capacity for Afghan people to organize, to mobilize, and fight for their own self-determination, for women and girls to fight for their rights to education, to liberty, to existence in society unrestricted and unfettered by rampant misogyny that runs amok in every society. And it is these people who are most going to suffer under the Taliban rule. The United States is done, and very likely all of those responsible will bear no consequences. The people who are going to suffer because of this are the Afghan people who are fighting desperately to continue their own self-determination, to continue their right to work, to education, to participation in their own society, to choose their government, and to use their own natural resources in the ways that they see fit, to engage with the world in ways that they want to. This is what we must support. We are already seeing massive people-led movements all across Afghanistan, women refusing to go back to being silenced, women refusing to stop going to school, ethnic minorities refusing to be hidden and silenced. and people standing up for their neighbors, despite the very, very real risks that this carries, as there are many confirmed reports of Taliban militants executing dissidents already.
And while the Afghan people are rising up, as socialists and citizens of Canada, this imperialist country, we must ensure that we never again allow our government to engage in such a pointless and bloody endeavor. To go even further, we should pressure our governments to actively oppose such policies, especially those of our close allies in NATO. Imperialist wars serve no purpose other to enrich the people that are already rich and to increase the power of the powerful. So what we say is down with the wars for empire. We instead wish for a world in which the working class asserts itself, and that is a world that might know peace.
Meanwhile, here at home, Justin Trudeau's primary tactic when discussing Afghanistan is to redirect conversation towards Canada's commitment to evacuating Afghans who collaborated with our military during our stay, which is a powerful moral obligation, but it deflects from any responsibility on Canada's part, and almost serves to paint us as heroes rather than the perpetrators of violence in this scenario. Trudeau is also saying that if he remains in power, they will be able to welcome 20,000 Afghan refugees, which, again, is a laudable commitment, but it fails to recognize the full scope of Canadian responsibility with regard to this absolute tragedy. Furthermore, we shouldn't be giving the Trudeau government any pats on the back when it comes to immigration. The Trudeau government deported an astonishing number of people back to very unsafe situations during a pandemic. This is not a government who should be trusted at face value when it comes to migration and refugee promises.
And while keeping on the topic of imperialism and Canadian foreign intervention, and also how absent a lot of this conversation is from our election cycle, we're going to provide our monthly update on Palestine, where the situation remains as dire as ever. The words of Mandela come to mind. We know all too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. That is how important this struggle is. Unsurprisingly, Israel has broken the ceasefire with Hamas as many as 10 times since the deal was struck earlier in May. Gaza has been bombed allegedly in retaliation for more incendiary balloons being flown over the border into Israel. Protests in Gaza surrounding the murder of a man in the northern part of the Strip led to escalations in violence, with a child, Omar Hassan Abu Anil, shot in the head by the occupation forces and eventually dying of his wounds. The siege of Gaza continues, and it is as horrendous as ever. This month, Israel decided to seize 23 tons of chocolate bars destined for Gaza under the pretense that sales might be used to fund Hamas military activity. The absolute absurdity and cruelty of the siege is as evident as ever. Other disturbing news from Palestine includes the story of pregnant prisoner Anhar al-Dik, who was nearly forced to give birth inside an Israeli prison until enough international pressure forced the occupying forces to release her before she had to do so.
While all of this is going on, Naftali Bennett has taken a trip to the United States to meet with President Biden. Biden, in a symbolic effort to look good internationally, has attempted to reopen the so-called peace process, requesting that Israel resume peace negotiations. Yet he has also committed to waiving entry visas for Israelis visiting the United States, as well as resupplying the Iron Dome missile defense system. The Israelis gain much, without the need to really give anything in return, aside from the occasional symbolic gestural requirement. On Canadian soil, when it comes to policy, we need to make ourselves heard during these elections. Many activist groups have come together to create ways of voting favorably for Palestine. One of the most prominent of these is the Vote Palestine Project, a campaign designed to galvanize concerned voters. The Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or CJPME, has done a lot of research into party platforms and individual MP stances on Palestine, and they have tons of information on their website. Canada Palestine Vote is another related organization. They run an Instagram account with easy-to-access information regarding MPs and their stances on Palestine. It is worth mentioning that of all of the current federal parties, the NDP has taken the strongest stance on the issue and has in its federal platform a commitment to ending the arms trade with Israel. Although vaguely worded and definitely in need of some stronger language, such a commitment is far above anything coming from the other parties. When it comes to Palestine, the NDP is often the best choice. There are a tiny minority of MPs and candidates in other parties who do support Palestinian liberation as well, but they are few and far between and often face a lot of backlash from their parties for speaking out in favor of Palestine. Most notably, recently, Janika Atwin and the Green Party. Most MPs are just not aware of Canadian-Israeli relations in much detail, and it's not really an item of high priority for people. As we said, foreign policy doesn't tend to be much of an issue in Canadian politics. Given the lack of attention that foreign policy receives, it's all the more important for us to make some noise about it. We need to vote in favor of MPs and candidates who support Palestine, and make it known that this is influencing our voting choices. Join one of the campaigns mentioned already and see how you can contribute to the cause of ending Canadian imperialism in Palestine and the collaboration with Israel.
And so those are the three major narratives we wanted to unpack this election month. Three major narratives from the pandemic to climate change and to imperialism that really will not see a commensurate amount of attention paid to really proportionate policies to tackle these crises. We get a lot of lip service in the media in the run up to this election, but we wanted to focus more on the actual work that needs to be done, the actual demands that need to be put forward to challenge the deep structural problems of capitalism today in Canada and internationally. But as we then end this episode, we want to do a few quick dives.
After all of these really intense, heavy stories, we wanted to bring you some, in case you missed it, little snippets of news that we thought were relevant to share, but didn't necessarily merit an entire section of the podcast this month.
So first, we're going to start off with the Red Scare that is continuing to live on in Canada. But we also want to cover then the vandals that are striking back. So on August 12th, unknown people spray painted a memorial honoring the 14th Waffen SS Division, which was formed in 1943 and fought on the Eastern Front. Of the people joining the 14th Waffen SS Division were members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who fought for independence from the Soviet Union and in doing so turned to Nazi Germany. In 1941, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists indeed played a leading role in the Lviv pogroms, where approximately 6,000 Jews were murdered.
Whereas the spray paint clearly identified this monument to the 14th Waffen SS Division as a Nazi monument, the CBC initially ran with the story under the heading of Edmonton Vandals Target a Ukrainian World War II Memorial with a Complicated History, before changing it to read, Jewish groups call for the removal of vandalized Ukrainian World War II memorial, still not actually articulating what the issue is, painting the vandalized Ukrainian memorial in a very sympathetic light. In appealing to the strong, wonderful Jewish resistance to this Nazi propaganda, the CBC instead decided to platform and legitimize B'nai B'rith, which is a group that supports the Israeli apartheid.
Now, this is not the first time that people labeled monuments commemorating the 14th Waffen SS Division for what they truly are, which is a Nazi war memorial. In 2020, a similar monument in Oakville was targeted, and initially, police treated the incident as a, quote, hate-motivated offense, which they were forced to walk back when people asked the question, is targeting Nazis really a hate-motivated offense? Yet, the most abhorrent whitewashing of history comes from our current Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, who repeatedly lauds her late grandfather and Nazi collaborator, Michael Komiak. Michael Komiak edited a pro-Nazi Ukrainian paper called Krakivsky Visti in Krakow and then in Vienna, which promoted aims common to the Ukrainian nationalist movement and the Nazis, namely the removal of Jews and other minorities.
This is important history to impart because our current government has put up another $4 million towards a Victims of Communism memorial being built in Ottawa, which brings this up to a total of $6 million taxpayer dollars. This was an idea put forward by Jason Kenney when he was an MP and a member of Harper's cabinet, and it's astonishing that it still has as much traction then as it does today, especially given that it was only going to cost a few $100,000 back when it was originally proposed. Furthermore, on August 23rd, known to some as Black Ribbon Day, Justin Trudeau tweeted, "On Black Ribbon Day, we remember the victims of communism and Nazism. We stand with the survivors and their descendants and with those who continue to face violence and persecution from authoritarian and totalitarian regimes." Now, we're not here to deny that there were atrocities committed under communist governments, but our government continues to rely on Red Scare tactics to undermine the organizing works of socialist groups and, by extension, casting suspicion on other community-led efforts to seize back power from the capitalist class.
It also makes me doubt the possibility of an electoral path towards socialism when our current government feels so comfortable comparing communism to Nazism and fascism. This is a battle of propaganda now, and one important strategy is to keep highlighting that their anti-communist rhetoric brings them closer to fascism than they're willing to let on, especially when we look to the nationalist movements burgeoning during World War II.
I also want to add on to this ill-fated Victims of Communism memorial. There are no historians and no experts being consulted in the construction or the memorialization of the Victims of Communism memorial. It is being partly funded by the government, but also partially funded by a Buy a Brick campaign where you can put money towards the construction of this memorial and also offer a name of someone that you are wanting to memorialize, done with the intention of allowing families who fled oppressive regimes to commemorate lost loved ones, but instead it is inadvertently being used as a billboard for Nazi propaganda, with many, many Nazis who were the victims of communism during World War II being memorialized, and it's only being recognized when public investigation into their website said, "Hey, wait a second. Why are we memorializing a Nazi general?" So the entire monument is just an absolute farce from the beginning. I mean, it was Jason Kenney's idea, right?
Lest we forget. Also, if Jason Kenney gets his way, all the people living under vaccine passports will also be added to the Victims of Communism Memorial one day.
Oh, God. Speaking of problematic memorials and problematic commemorations, Ryerson has announced that they are in the process of changing their name, or should I call it X University is in the process of changing its name. They have announced that they are beginning the name change process, though they have not disclosed what the name change is going to be. And as the Beavertons so eloquently put it, Ryerson struggles to find a name of a Canadian historical figure who didn't have problematic associations.
We very much welcome the news that Ryerson will be changing its name, and this is continuing a whole trend of other institutions and streets being renamed to no longer commemorate people who were slave owners or supported very racist ideologies, or in the case of Ryerson, designing a whole residential school program that enacted genocide on Indigenous people.
And finally, let's end off on some wonderful news. So 2 more Indigo stores in Ontario have voted to unionize in the last couple of weeks. So since September of 2020, a total of 6 locations have unionized. From the Toronto Star, Greta Whipple, who has been at the Yorkdale Indigo since 2016, said COVID has shone a spotlight on a number of existing issues, including low wages, lack of paid sick time, a perceived lack of fairness with performance reviews and raises, and the feeling that the company saw its workers as disposable. There's a wonderful quote from Leslie Prince, who's involved with the UFCW Local 1006A, which is the local that the chapter's Indigo stores are unionized through. Quote, "People expect these kinds of jobs to be precarious, but more and more workers are realizing they don't have to be. And this is pointing to a wave of retail unionizations and just further spurring on the growing class consciousness of workers who are realizing that part-time, precarious, low-wage labor does not have to be this dead end. You can collaborate with your comrades, with your colleagues, and build something better, more sustainable, and fairer for everyone there and everyone who comes after.
What a hopeful note to end on.
Yeah. Power to the people. The people are the way forward, and it is only through collaboration that we will get through.
Yes, and like always, all of the groups we've mentioned that are organizing to fight for a better future and for a better present, you'll find that all in the description below. We've talked about a lot of really pressing issues. At times, it's really overwhelming, but we invite all the people out there to get involved and to help build up our own power.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this month's episode of The Red Review. Keep your ears tuned for mid-month updates. We usually have some extra content that we couldn't fit into the main episode coming out in the middle of the month, so please stay tuned for that.
And as always, if you find yourself agreeing with the politics that we're talking about here, we urge you to get involved, and that could involve getting involved with Socialist Action as a revolutionary party that is synthesizing these demands and is organizing with other groups to build up worker power. Until next month, stay well, comrades, and stay safe.
And stay active.